On October 19th of 1781, the battlefield at Yorktown is silent, but instead of British troops surrendering, it's Washington's army laying down their arms. The revolution has failed. The dream of American independence, dead. No United States, no Constitution, no superpower shaping the modern world. So what happens next? Would Britain tighten its grip or allow the colonies more freedom? Would democracy still spread, or would monarchy rule unchecked? Would another revolution rise, or would America remain forever British? This is the ultimate what if. What if the American Revolution failed? Let's find out. In 1777, the tide of the war could have turned dramatically at Saratoga. This battle was the moment France decided to officially support the American revolutionaries. But what if the British won decisively? Without France's aid, the colonists would have been starved of supplies, money, and troops. The revolution might have collapsed before it ever reached its final stages. Another turning point, 1781 at Yorktown. In reality, a Franco-American force trapped Cornwallis, forcing his surrender. But if the British Navy had broken the blockade, reinforcements would have arrived. Washington's army, outnumbered and exhausted, would have been annihilated. With the revolutionaries crushed, the colonies would have remained under firm British rule. A failed revolution also meant that loyalists who supported British rule would have been emboldened. The Continental Congress would have been dissolved, and the leaders of the rebellion would have faced the ultimate punishment. But what happens next? Would the British allow reforms, or would they rule with an iron fist? Would another revolution have sparked later? The war could have ended, but the spirit of rebellion may not have died so easily. Now, in 1782, with the rebellion crushed, a grim fate awaits its leaders. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, even Benny Franklin. These names, well, they wouldn't be remembered as heroes, they'd be remembered as traitors. Captured revolutionaries would have been executed, like Scottish rebels in the Jacobite uprisings. Now, Washington in particular might have suffered a public hanging to make an example out of him. Others, like Franklin and Adams, may have fled to France or Spain, living out their days in exile. Now, for the average soldier of the Continental Army, the consequences would have been severe. Many would have been imprisoned in British jails or deported to penal colonies, like Australia. Those who fought for independence would be branded as criminals, their property seized, and their families ruined. But what about the ideas of revolution, liberty, self-governance, democracy? Without America's successful break from Britain, could the world have still embraced these values? Would revolution still have spread, or would the failure in America serve as a warning that monarchy was the only way forward? In 1800, Britain rules North America as it always did, but now with a much tighter control. The American colonies, once rebellious, are now subjugated territories. The British government, eager to prevent another uprising, clamps down on freedoms. The colonial assemblies are dissolved or severely restricted. The idea of self-rule gets snuffed out. The royal governors, once mere representatives of the king, now rule with absolute authority. Economic policies shift. Taxation without representation continues. The infamous taxes on tea and stamps, which sparked the revolution in the first place, are now the norm. Smuggling and underground resistance movements persist, but there's no longer any hope of an independent United States. Would Britain have granted some autonomy, similar to Canada and Australia in later years, or would the colonies have remained under strict rule, their voices unheard? Without independence, the 13 colonies don't form a single united nation. Over time, regional differences could have led to British-controlled North America fragmenting into separate dominions rather than one powerful country. In 1830, North America now looks drastically different. The British Empire has expanded westward, but under controlled settlement rather than the rapid frontier expansion of an independent U.S. Without American independence, the concept of manifest destiny never really emerges. Westward expansion is dictated by the British government, likely prioritizing stability over reckless expansion. Relations with Native American tribes remains different. Without the U.S. government's aggressive land policies, tribes may have retained some autonomy. Canada and the American colonies remain British, but tensions exist. Would there be a push for more independence, or would the colonies simply integrate further into British rule? Without the Louisiana Purchase, France holds on to its North American territories a bit longer. Could the British and French clash again in North America? Well, a British-controlled continent would also mean greater military involvement in future European conflicts. If Britain maintained its grip in North America, would it have had greater global dominance heading into the 19th and 20th centuries? In 1783, the Treaty of Paris never happens. France, which poured vast resources into supporting the American rebels, is left humiliated. A successful British suppression of the revolution means that France's financial crisis worsens. Without the inspiration of the American Revolution, does the French Revolution still occur? Or does Louis XVI's rule continue, keeping France a monarchy for much longer? Spain, too, had been watching the conflict closely. Spain had its own American colonies and feared that revolution would spread. With a failed revolution in America, Spain's grip on Latin America remains stronger, at least for now. However, with no United States to provide an example, independence movements in South America might have struggled. Figures like Simón Bolívar might have never found the inspiration to fight against Spanish rule. Now, would the world still see the fall of European colonial empires, or would monarchy and imperial rule remain dominant well into the modern age? Let's go to 1787. There's no constitutional convention taking place, and since there's no U.S. Constitution, no Bill of Rights, there's no guiding framework for democratic governance. The U.S. never becomes a beacon of democratic ideals. The ideas of representative government and individual freedoms, which inspired revolutions worldwide, might have never taken hold. So how does this change the world? Would France's attempt at democracy fail without the American example? Would monarchies remain unchallenged? The world may have developed slower, clinging to old systems of rule rather than embracing the democratic revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. If the American Revolution never succeeded, the very foundation of modern democracy may have crumbled before it ever had a chance to change the world. In 1807, British officially banned the transatlantic slave trade, but slavery in North America remains a complicated issue. Without an independent U.S., the abolition movement takes a different path. The southern colonies, still under British rule, continued to rely on slavery as the backbone of their economy. However, Britain's growing anti-slavery sentiment could have led to earlier abolition in the colonies. Would this have prevented a war like the American Civil War, or caused a different kind of rebellion? Historically, Britain abolished slavery in all of its colonies by 1833. If the American colonies were still under British rule, slavery might have ended decades earlier than it did in the U.S. But would this have led to economic collapse in the South? Would plantation owners rebel against British rule as they did against the U.S. government in 1861? Alternatively, if Britain allowed the practice to continue for economic reasons, slavery might have lasted even longer. Would we have seen civil rights movements emerge earlier, or would racial tensions have developed differently under British control? One thing's for certain, without the unique conditions of an independent U.S., the struggle over slavery takes an entirely different course. In 1850, the world is changing rapidly, powered by coal, steam engines, and mechanized production. But without the U.S., how different would the Industrial Revolution be? An independent U.S. played a major role in driving industrial innovation. Mass production techniques, railroad expansion, and rapid urbanization helped shape the modern economy. Without America as an industrial giant, does Britain retain its dominance for longer, or does another power rise in its place? Without the American market, British industry may have stagnated. The U.S. was a massive consumer of British goods, but if the colonies remained under direct British rule, trade might have been more restricted. Would Canada or Australia have become the new centers of industrial progress instead? Another key factor is innovation. Many American inventions, from the telegraph to the assembly line, revolutionized industry. Without the U.S. leading the charge, does technology develop more slowly? Would Germany, France, or even Russia have taken the lead instead? The Industrial Revolution does still happen, but without American influence. Its scale, speed, and impact on global power shifts are dramatically altered. Now let's go to 1860, the concept of manifest destiny. The idea that Americans were destined to expand westward never takes root. Without the U.S., the western frontier remains under tighter British control. Expansion is slower, more regulated, and possibly less violent toward Native American tribes. The British government, unlike the U.S., had a history of negotiating treaties rather than enforcing forced removals like the Trail of Tears. Would there have been a large-scale migration westward at all? Without an independent U.S., Texas never fights for independence from Mexico. There's no war with Mexico in 1846 and no annexation of California or the Southwest. Would the modern-day U.S. have remained a small cluster of eastern seaboard colonies, while Mexico and Britain controlled the rest? Could Britain and Spain have fought over the West instead? If so, would Latin America look different today? Well, one thing's clear. The map of North America would be completely different if the United States never existed. Now in 1875, Native American tribes still exist in large numbers across North America. Without an expansionist U.S., their fate could have been dramatically different. Under British rule, Native tribes may have had better protections. Unlike the U.S. government, which aggressively pursued land seizures, Britain was often more willing to work with indigenous leaders. Would large Native American nations still exist today? Could they have formed semi-autonomous regions under British control, similar to Canada's system of indigenous governance? Alternatively, would Britain have eventually pushed westward and treated Native American populations just like the U.S. did? After all, the British Empire does have a history of conflicts with indigenous people worldwide. Would Native Americans have had greater political power, or would they have faced the same struggles, or even harsher struggles, under a different ruling power? Let's talk about 1861. The American Civil War? It never happens, but does that mean North America avoids conflict altogether? Well, if Britain still controlled the American colonies, the issue of slavery would still be a major point of tension. Would Southern plantation owners rebel against British rule if London pushed for abolition? Perhaps a colonial independence movement emerges later in the 19th century. Instead of fighting over slavery, the colonies might push for autonomy, similar to Canada's gradual separation from Britain. Or if Britain permitted slavery for economic reasons, could it have lasted longer? Would the South have become its own British-aligned dominion, separate from the northern colonies? Without the Civil War, industrialization in the South could have been delayed, altering the economic balance of North America for decades. Now we go to 1914. World War I erupts in Europe, but what role does North America play if the U.S. never existed? Well, without the United States, Britain may have retained tighter control over North American territories, leading to greater involvement in European wars. Could British control North America have been dragged into World War I even earlier? Alternatively, without an industrialized U.S., the war may have ended differently. Would Britain have had the same level of economic and military support without the resources of an independent America? And if North America remained divided under British and Spanish rule, would the power dynamics of global war shift entirely? It's a good question. Now we go to 1945. World War II ends and the world braces for a new global rivalry. But what if the U.S. never existed? Well, instead of a U.S.-Soviet Cold War, would Britain and the Soviet Union have become two superpowers? Without the U.S., the Soviet Union could have expanded unchecked. Would communism have spread further into Europe, Asia, and even parts of North America? Would Britain, Canada, and Australia have formed a new Western alliance against Soviet influence, or would the world have remained under European control? A failed American Revolution might mean a Cold War that looks completely unrecognizable compared to the one we know now. Now in 2000, North America is still part of the British Commonwealth. Instead of the United States, the continent consists of British-controlled provinces, stretching from New England to the Pacific. Would people still view themselves as Americans or as British citizens? Would democracy have flourished, or would centralized rule have remained dominant? Would an independent America have eventually formed in the 20th century, following a Canadian-style independence movement? The modern world might be unrecognizable if the American Revolution had failed. Now, could the American colonies have ever stayed under British rule permanently, or was revolution inevitable? If the revolution failed in 1781, could another uprising have emerged in the 1800s? Was America's independence destined to happen no matter what? Or in another reality, do we still live under the British crown today? History is shaped by the smallest twists of fate. One battle, one leader, one decision. What if things had just gone a little differently? Would you be watching this video from the United States or the British-American Commonwealth? Think about it. Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you love alternate histories, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the past.